You're listening to the Max Planck Lawcast, which showcases the academic research currently being conducted across the Max Planck Law Network. I'm your host, Christopher Murphy, and together we'll be talking to some of the more than 400 researchers who are pushing the frontiers of legal knowledge in Germany and abroad. When it comes to new and exciting legal research, the Lawcast has you covered. Thank you very much for tuning in to the next episode of the Max Planck Lawcast. It's wonderful to have you here with us today. Well, on today's episode, we're going to be going back in time to the early 17th century to look at the English poor laws. However, we won't be staying in Europe for too long because we're going to be looking at how these laws were transferred across the Atlantic to the Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Along the way, we'll be seeing how the laws themselves were adapted to meet the new challenges and discern how certain maxims continue to be of relevance today. To do so, I'm joined in the studio by Victoria Hooton. Victoria is currently a senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory in Frankfurt. Victoria, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great you're on here. Now, I guess most of our listeners will be aware of what the modern welfare state is, but the knowledge base will probably thin out somewhat when it comes to the English poor laws from 5 centuries ago. Do you want to maybe give us a rundown of what these laws are about?
Yeah, sure. So in layman's terms, the poor laws were basically a system of welfare and poverty relief in England. They prescribed that taxes should be raised at the local level to house, board, clothe, and often even employ the local poor. When discussing poor law research, it's really critical to determine whether one is talking about the old poor law or the new poor law. What scholars refer to as the Old Poor Law, or often commonly the Elizabethan Poor Law, is the comparison point of origin of my research. And that's usually referring to 2 acts of the late 16th and early 17th century, which consolidated existing legislation relating to poverty into 2 statutes that became the basis of this poor law system until widespread reform in 1834, when the new poor law took over, a much more punitive system. That law doesn't form the basis of my research. I focus on the Old Poor Law, and my starting point is the 1601 Act for the Relief of the Poor.
Okay. The 1601 Act, that was a national law passed by Westminster?
Yeah, that's correct. It was a national law, but much like legislation passed before it, it had very local implications. So essentially, this legislation set out key obligations of the localities regarding the provision of financial assistance and benefits in kind for their poor, a class of individuals that the Act actually left quite broadly undefined. And the actual implementation of these obligations was, for the most part, left to the discretion of local authorities. The Act only really went so far as setting out the bare bones of responsibility. But we can summarize sort of imperfectly these provisions from the Act into 3 types. So types that created taxation and funds and institutions for the poor, provisions ascribing responsibility for the administrators of those funds and institutions, and finally, enforceability or accountability mechanisms. But parliamentary intervention didn't really just stop in 1601. There were multiple pieces of legislation flowing from Parliament on this that would constitute the entirety of the poor law system, because setting out the bare bones did not come without its issues, and they needed to consistently clarify.
Okay. And that's what you mean then by it's not the poor law, it's rather the poor laurs.
Oh, yeah. It was a complex web of contradictions and constant amendments throughout the decades.
I see. Okay. From 1601 onwards, continually new laws relating to the administration. And And did they ever define who was poor?
No, I think there was some discussion prior to the new poor law on whether they should make classifications of poor individuals.
Okay.
But there was never anything really set in stone. This was really left to the discretion of local actors. Mainly the adjustments were minute adjustments relating to certain borders or certain reporting obligations, or quite big adjustments. So, for instance, in 1662, they introduced something called settlement, which meant paupers were tied to a particular local area. They couldn't go and ask for relief elsewhere.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. I guess we'll touch on that, I think, later on. But tell me before we go on where a pauper can and cannot go to, who was actually responsible for administering the laws then?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it was really a local affair. The poor laws were implemented at what we know as the parish level. So this is the small church-centred areas of local government. There were probably around at the time 15,000 such parishes, varying. Yeah.
So when you say a parish, as in the way I understand it, a church parish, an area with a large, smaller church there, and they're responsible. They have a certain area.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the locality around a church. Yeah.
Okay, right. Mm-hmm. And that's also an area for government as well, or was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the parish area became also an area for local administration and local government. In terms of the actual administrative personnel, there were already some key roles established prior to the 17th century that continued under this old poor law. So, for instance, the church wardens of the parish would play an important role alongside what were termed the overseers of the poor. And this was a role already in place in 1601, but it continued. And essentially, they were the first port of call for all poor law related issues. They did the raising of taxation, they did the distributing of taxation, and essentially did all of the heavy lifting of the law on the ground.
Okay, so that would be possibly seen as a bit of a poison chalice, that role, right? I mean, I'm sure it wasn't so easy you have to look at all the laws, and then you don't know how how a pauper is to be defined, and then you have to collect the money from the rich and give to the poor.
Yeah, a little bit.
Was Robin Hood an overseer?
That's a good question, actually. Perhaps he was based on one. It was certainly seen as a poison chalice, I think, although the personalities that filled this role obviously varied. But the Act did give some stipulations as to who it should be. It stipulated church wardens for each parish should nominate 2 to 4 such overseers, and they should be substantial householders. So it indicated they should be someone of a certain level of standing.
A certain standing status.
Yeah. In reality, this didn't work in practice. Usually the overseer was someone of a lower standing than the church warden. And this would make sense because, as you say, the role is not enjoyable. It's not an enviable task.
No.
And it remained largely unremunerated for many decades and had the chance to make one deeply unpopular with locals. So the likelihood is you're a busy overseer, you have to either ask people to part with their hard-earned cash, or you're giving people less than they think they deserve.
Okay, so you're basically not making anyone happy.
You're not making many
overseer
friends.
of the poor. Okay.
And this could, in some circumstances, lead to some threats of physical violence even. And on top of that, as you say, the work was really heavily administrative. You had to keep on top of who had paid what, who had received what, and what the actual law said.
Okay, well, and did the overseers have staff? Were they, or was it that
They were the staff?
they were?
Unfortunately,
They were entirely responsible for their parish.
Yeah, they had a huge burden and a huge workload. And really interestingly, there's an anonymous work from this time that sets out the importance of the role and some of the key characteristics that someone should have if they're going to be an overseer. And it's written in very worthy terms. It says they should be sort of wealthy, wise, and of good conscience. So they should not themselves be poor, because then they invite scorn, mistrust, or even they abuse their office. And they should be wise enough to understand exactly what the law says and the importance of the office. But I'm afraid this wasn't the case in practice, actually.
Right. Although I suppose when you say not the case in practice, I mean, I don't know how many parishes are we talking about were there, and they were obviously in England at the time.
In the thousands, so in the tens of thousands
And in certain parishes it obviously worked well or better, and in other parishes it didn't work so well.
Yeah, so there would have been overseers of the poor that were incredibly dedicated to the task and really wanted to actually do a good job of it, and they would stay in the role for many years. But there were probably also overseers of the poor that were not so dedicated to the task, and
it didn't run so smoothly.
And,
how do you go about getting information about the whole setup itself in the parish? Did they document it themselves, or were you going into old church archives looking for? Sounds like a Da Vinci Code, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a wild goose chase, I guess. Yeah. So one has to do some kind of archival work. I'm quite lucky that my research involves a lot of trawling through statutes as a lawyer, and those are published materials that should in theory, be relatively easy to come by.
Okay.
But as you say, what complicates the matter is that we're not just looking at a legislative framework, we're looking at that framework and then how it actually works on the ground. So the poor laws themselves and as they were administered is scattered among various different places. So if I want to look at the law, the drafting of the law, the implementation, or debating around it, I would go to the Parliamentary Archives in London.
Okay. So it's not digitalised, or it is...
Not yet. So
No.
I haven't
Microfiche?
I haven't been able to find even one single source that digitizes all of the poor laws through the centuries. There are obviously some great initiatives online that seek to give access to these statutes. So the Statutes Project is one of them, and workhouses.org is another. They try to give key pieces of legislation, but they're not all in the same place. I've been quite lucky with the Canadian archives, because actually all of the laws passed in the time that I look at have been digitized into the British North America Legislative Database from the University of New Brunswick. So that's been a real gold mine for me because it makes everything so much easier. And it's not just the original acts, but kind of translated into a more readable format. So they've done a great job and I've been really lucky with that.
That's brilliant. Well, which is good that you're actually then looking more so at the poor laws, not in the UK, but the poor laws in Canada. Don't go away, because we're going to have plenty more for you after this short break.
Welcome to Max Planck Law, one of the world's largest networks for legal research, based in Germany. Our world-class institutes invite applications for fully funded PhD and postdoc opportunities in almost any area of law. Join a thriving community of over 400 researchers in an international and interdisciplinary environment. Experience the high quality of life that Germany offers while collaborating with colleagues across institutes, working and writing in English. We provide you with unique specialist libraries, excellent workspaces, and support in developing your research and your academic career. Apply today. For more information, visit law.mpg.de.
Welcome back to the Lawcast. Thanks for listening to us today. Well, let's then move from the old world to the new world. So when the British colonised what's modern-day Canada, they took their laws with them, including the poor laws.
Yeah, around about, although it wasn't really a direct transfer of sort of British control via poor laws. So the British took the colony at Halifax from around 1749. And shortly after that, you start to see legal institutions such as courts, justice of the peace, start to emerge. And around a decade later, after a little bit of argumentation with the governor, they did set up a General Assembly, so a legislative assembly in Halifax in Nova Scotia. And that ran from around 1758. And almost immediately in the first few sessions, that legislative assembly decided to pass a poor law, which is super interesting.
Okay, yeah. Why do you find it so interesting or super interesting?
At this point in my research, I can't find a reason why they would want to pass a poor law. They're not exactly without contention as rules go. But what I wonder is whether they were simply trying to make a transfer of all big legislative frameworks from the metropole into the newly settling colony. So to look at what this General Assembly was busying itself with in the first couple of years, you know, they were trying to do most social and economic legislative frameworks like property, like trade, as well as justice and defence. So it could just be that it was brought over as kind of a package deal of what legislation do we need, or there's this poor law. But what's quite interesting as a lawyer is that by this point in time, the English poor laws had much time to develop, and it's a much more comprehensive system. And yet the Nova Scotia legislature doesn't take it as that. It takes sort of the very bare bones of the system. They don't, for instance, take updates that are meant to clarify the working of the law. They kind of
updates that they would have known about, but they decided to...
Yeah, it's not entirely provable that they would have known about it, but if you have enough knowledge of the system itself, you would probably know about at least some of the big changes in the law. And later on, there are suggestions that they borrowed from different parts of the system again, so they probably knew something of it. So, for instance, they took all of the bare minimum institutions. They built a workhouse to house the homeless and the able-bodied poor. They created the role of an overseer of the poor. They distinguished between people who were the proper object of charity or not, just as the English system had. But it makes sense that they would just take the bare bones as a newly settled colony with maybe not so much of a deal.
Sure, yeah. I wonder whether they were striving for something more egalitarian maybe as well, where they think we've got this new society, we'd like to, attach importance to having poor laws. If it's possible to find out, or it'd be interesting to know who the driving parties were, I guess, behind it.
This is something that definitely crossed my mind, and somewhere I have a almost decipherable list of exactly who was in that first General Assembly. It would be really good to dig into those personalities and see, okay, who came up with the idea of a poor law here.
Right, yeah. Just something else for you to work on.
Yes.
At the time when Canada was colonised, you had Nova Scotia, and you'd have other ones as well?
That had a poor law?
No,
at this time.
So I guess what I'm getting at then is, did all the provinces in Canada have poor laws?
Actually, Nova Scotia and later New Brunswick, when that was partitioned, were really the exception on this. Other provinces opted to deal with poverty and pauperism in other ways. And even in the maritime region that I study, it's really only Nova Scotia and New Brunswick that adopted something like this. And New Brunswick probably because it had been part of Nova Scotia. So St. John's Island, or today as it's known, Prince Edward Island, was part of this region at the same time under British control, but no poor law was even adopted there. So there was even a difference in the maritime area. And one can put this down to the fact that the island was an island. It had a minimal population, no government. And Dennis Guest uses these ideas to kind of justify why it probably didn't have a poor law. He was a scholar of early social security in Canada. So this really leaves Nova Scotia and New Brunswick as the exception. So if we contrast them to Upper Canada, which is just above the region, which is largely what's now Ontario, they legislated against having a poor law. They made it impossible via legislation. So the complete opposite.
A complete different approach.
In the late 18th century. And that might seem a little extreme, but it could simply reflect the fact that these are a contested form of law. For one, it can be seen as forced charity, and it can also be seen as an intervention of the state where maybe the state should not be intervening, and personal responsibility, philanthropy and charity of others should be more of the goal. Although it can also perhaps be suggested that they introduced this late enough to have assessed the situation in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and thought, okay, we want no part of whatever's happening over here.
Okay, all right. What did those provinces look like at the time these laws were enacted? I mean, they were obviously very different to a little parish in England, which had a nice little steeple and a church, and it had been established for a long, long time. What did the provinces look like, and what challenges did that bring about for introducing the poor laws?
I think they certainly didn't have the privilege of the stability that English parishes had. The provinces at this time were probably attractive if you were a fisherman, and not so much if you were anything else. So if we take the start of the colony, or even sort of a decade later, the start of the General Assembly as our starting point. At this point, the British have been fighting with the French over the territory. There's been this is a battlefield, or has been just a battlefield. And then they have gone on and turned to expulsing the old French Acadian settlers. So this was a site of dispute. It was a site of battle. And
the English had won then, and then went about removing any resistance then?
They were about removing resistance, even though there's not so much evidence that the resistance was there, but just in case, they wanted really to secure this part of British North America to make sure that there was no threat to their being there. So the land that then became occupied was not exactly going to be in a good shape. Even the land that had been settled by the older French Acadians wasn't a forgiving territory if you're used to something like England or New England. England because it was marshland, and Nova Scotia's all forestry and seas, it's a difficult terrain at the best of times. So when you add war in and the effects of that, it was not exactly a fruitful terrain and was actually quite difficult to settle, according to geographical historians of this period.
Right, okay. And then so it was obviously far more spread out, isolated, ruinous war. So it's a very different place that you're trying to set up these laws. What role then does the church play in Canada?
It's a good question.
Because they obviously played a very active role in England. Did we say in England?
Yeah.
Not the UK, or were the Poor Laws in, when we say the UK, or was it mainly in England that Poor Laws?
England and Wales.
England and Wales, okay. So they obviously played a very different role than England and Wales. How was it in the colonies?
Yeah, so how church wardens played this quite vital role in the English Poor Laws. They were also originally incorporated into the Halifax Poor Law. So the first piece of legislation only related to the town of Halifax, so the most kind of settled part of the province. So in December 1759, when the General Assembly was still relatively new, they passed the first sort of taxation piece of legislation. So rather than voluntary contributions, which they unsurprisingly had found ineffectual, they started the system of taxation. And this would be raised via assessments of the church wardens of the vestries of St. Paul's in the city. So they played a similar role, and it was very much mirroring what was happening in England. Interestingly, when the Poor Law was updated in 1763, which was the same year it started to apply to the entire province, the reference to the church wardens was dropped from the law. Yeah, instead, the justices of the peace, which are like a low-level judiciary, administrative enforcement kind of body, they would appoint 5 individuals to do all of this assessment on the local inhabitants and to raise that kind of relief. And they would be fined if they refused to undertake this role. So you kind of see, okay, there's probably less religious personnel, less religious motivation for helping. So you need some financial incentive to aid the relief of the poor.
Yeah, right. Okay. So still a poison chalice.
Yeah, absolutely.
So based on my homework, 1784, Nova Scotia is partitioned, and you have the new colony of New Brunswick. It then enacts its own poor laws, or takes the poor laws from Nova Scotia, or takes them from England and Wales.
Yeah, it has a little bit of an interesting patchwork going on in New Brunswick. So they gained their own legislative assembly from 1786. And quite like the Nova Scotian one, they took the initiative pretty much immediately to make a plan for poor relief. So already that year, they enshrined into law the role of the overseer and said these people are going to be appointed in the same way by the Justice of the Peace, and they would also pass an act to provide for the relief of the poor. And in a way, it kept the Nova Scotian approach. So Nova Scotia had some differences with England. For instance, they split the role of the overseer, so they only distributed funds and reported on the state of the poor, whereas the actual assessing and the collecting of the funds would be done by a different body, which was not the most successful attempt at lightening the load, to be honest. It made things more complicated. Then you have to regulate every step of the way when something goes wrong. But this was retained in New Brunswick, so they definitely took probably more of the Nova Scotia approach, but they had their own innovations for sure. The most striking one was probably that the first poor relief legislation allowed for the contracting out of paupers, rather than them just being set into work in a particular house, which they also could be. They allowed for the building of a house to put them to work, but it's very likely they didn't have the funds or the property necessary to do this. So without that kind of institutional support, they actually relied on people taking the poor in, putting them to work for a particular sum of money. And this idea probably stemmed from the New England settlers that were quite common in the New Brunswick area, as this practice can be seen in New England as well, in one of the 13 colonies. And mass use of this form of poor relief basically ended in what's known as pauper auctions, which are about as bad as they sound.
Pauper auctions?
Yes.
Okay. That doesn't sound like something you want to be on the wrong end of, a pauper option. That sounds rather scary, archaic, and right, so explain a little bit more about a pauper auction. Yeah,
it certainly wasn't a pleasant ordeal, probably for anybody involved. So the original New Brunswick Poor Relief Act stipulated the overseers could contract paupers out to a person, offering to keep them for basically the lowest cost It also said they should be careful about this, that there's no inhumane treatment going to occur.
So the lowest bid, so to say,
the
received
lowest
the
bidder
pauper.
would receive the pauper, so long as they weren't going to inhumanely treat them. But the Act didn't really make any enforcement mechanism for making sure they were taken care of, and nor did it give a time frame for when this would end. So essentially, if you're able to find employment, maybe you get out. If you're not able,
you could remain.
This is going to be probably a tough time for the foreseeable. So basically, with overseers being quite burdened and busy, probably too many paupers, not enough relief, this eventually ended in an annual pauper auction, where the lowest bidder would get what they wanted.
And they could take in multiple paupers.
Or maybe just one, but probably not in the best circumstances. So in the later 19th century, some scholars have uncovered that there were inquests where paupers had died as a result of the poor treatment that they received when they went into this form of relief.
Because they were kind of they were servants, basically.
Essentially, and there was no kind of checking up on whether they were fed adequately, clothed adequately, given adequate heating. And the matter is, if you yourself are also on the poverty line and you buy a pauper, you probably can't afford to actually keep them. So many lesser abuses probably went much unnoticed until this system went out of fashion.
It was then abolished, the pauper auctions.
It sort of slowly slipped out with the rise in institutionalism. So when there was more institutional support and workhouses to put the paupers to work in, this became less of a thing.
Because it sounds like quite dangerous from the pauper side that it was once a pauper, always a pauper. It sounds like very difficult to get out of that system then.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was no incentive for the individual to kind of treat the pauper well, so they got them at a very low price.
Absolutely. And did they pay the pauper or they paid the parish, and the parish then gave that to the pauper?
They paid the parish, and from what I can tell, maybe by taking the pauper, they also maybe got some relief from having to pay the taxation towards poor relief. So there was probably some incentive there to take them. But then once they were there, there's no incentive to make sure you're paying for enough food or something, and getting the most out of your money is obviously going to entail something not exactly nice for the individual taken into service.
As you say, it's like rough lands and a lot of hard work involved, and and probably difficult to control.
Absolutely.
Good that they were abolished.
Yes, very good that they went out of fashion for sure.
Yeah. Then I guess my final question would be, if we to learn from the past, what indelible mark have the pauper laws left on the modern welfare state and the ideology of charity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are definitely some resonances in the modern welfare state as we know it from the time of kind of poor laws. So if we look to the UK, for instance, it's suffered a very tremendous period of austerity and the retraction of the welfare state. So you see punitive benefits sanctions and an ever-changing goalpost for what fitness for work looks like. And so there's still definitely some strong ideas about deservingness and about poverty as an individual responsibility rather than a simple fact of capitalism or economies. So in my major research area where most of my publication history is centered, which is European Union law, some of the framework on migration within the European Union and access to welfare there has been dubbed a form of poor law. And when you look at some of the debates around free movement in the Union, benefits access and the rhetoric of benefit tourists and people with the wrong motives for moving somewhere, you can see again that very intense localism, as I mentioned before, with the settlement system. You should belong to an area and this is the area that keeps you. So those very geographical boundaries of welfare responsibility are something that still exists today.
So deeply ingrained within the system.
Deeply ingrained, absolutely. And that will exist for some time to come yet.
Okay. Yeah. Well, at least we've gotten rid of the pauper auctions. So
thankfully
we are moving onwards.
We've improved somewhat.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, Vicky, thanks so much for coming on the show. Thanks for telling us about your research. I really enjoyed having you here, and best of luck with it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Lawcast. If you'd like more information about Max Planck Law, or if you'd like to get involved, please visit us at law.mpg.de.
Max Planck Law. Excellence in legal research.